So our first fallacy is a hasty generalization. As we discussed before, generalization is when you make ground assumptions from a very small sample or something that's not supported. Making assumptions about the whole group or range or class based on a sample that is inadequate, usually because it's atypical or too small. Stereotypes about people. Librarians are shy and smart. Wealthy people are snobs. A common example of principle underlying hasty generalization is something that we discussed and something that you know as a stereotype. If we meet 2 or 3 people that are nice to us in certain country, we believe that this country is nice. And if we don't meet good people or something bad happens to us, we make a generalization about the whole country, all people in this country. So let's see example. My roommate said her philosophy class was hard. And the one I am in is hard too. All philosophy classes must be hard. 2 people's experience are, in this case, not enough on which to base a conclusion. So we have to be careful when we make our generalizations. So it's it. How to deal with this or how to avoid this type of fallacy is ask yourself what kind of sample you're using. So let's be specific. Sample is representation from this particular class or group. So for example, if I want a representative sample in my university, I need to ask several people in every group, maybe. For example, if I make a research about Kazakhstan, and if I want to know the opinion of people about certain brand of tea, I cannot just ask 10 people and say this is the brand that they like. I need the sample that would be representative. I need the sample that would include both women and men. I need the sample that would include different range, age range. And I need a sample that would be not only from Almaty, but from other cities as well. It should be maybe like Astana and Almaty and some other cities. Otherwise, the sample is not representative, or I can not make any judgment about people in maybe the preference of people of Kazakhstan about tea. So I need it to be representative. So that's what sample is. Sometimes we call it pool, especially when we make certain surveys. So sample, ask yourself what kind of sample you're using. Are you relying on the opinion or experience of just few people, or your own experience in just a few situations? If so, consider whether you need more evidence or perhaps less sweeping conclusion. Notice that in the example, the more modest conclusion, some philosophy classes are hard for some students, would not be a hasty generalization. So you need either the sample that's representative to make a generalization, or you need to make a more, to use more guarding terms such as some, certain, depending on number of people, you can say many, majority if it's more than 50%. So you can think about that. Posthoc, also called false cause. The fallacy gets its name from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates after this, therefore because of this. Assuming because B comes after A caused B. Of course, sometimes one event really does cause another one that comes after. For example, if I register for a class and my name later appears on the roll, it is true that first event caused the one that came later. But sometimes 2 events that seem related in time aren't really related, cause an event. This is a correlation, isn't the same thing as causation. President Jones raised tax, and then the rate of violent crime went up. Jones is responsible for the rise in crime. The increase in taxes might or might not be one factor rising the crime rates. But the argument hasn't shown us that one caused the other. So, if we wanted to prove that tax raise was caused, the violent crimes were caused by tax rate, we need to conduct a survey and ask those people why they committed certain crime. And if it is were to protest against or because it made them angry, that would certainly support the claim. But if we don't have this data, it's absolutely impossible to make this type of conclusion. To avoid post-hoc fallacy, the arguer would need to give us some more explanation of the process by which tax increase is supposed to have produced a higher crime rate. And that's what you should do to avoid committing a fallacy. If you say A causes B, you should have something more to say about A caused B than just A came first and B came later. It's not correct. And that's the fallacy to avoid. Slippery slope. The arguer claims that a sort of chain reaction, usually ending in some dire consequences, will take place, but there's really not enough evidence for that assumption. The arguer asserts that if you take even one step into slippery slope, we will end up sliding all the way to the bottom. He or she assumes that we can't stop partway down the hill. So for example, animal experimentation reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we're likely to be more and more tolerant of violent acts like war and murder. Soon our society will become a battlefield on which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It will be end of civilization. To prevent this terrible consequence, we should make animal experimentation illegal right now. Okay, and that's a slippery slope. Since animal experimentation has been legal for some time and civilization has not yet ended, it seems particularly clear the chain of events won't necessarily take place. Even if we believe that experimenting on animals reduces respect for life, and the loss of respect for life makes us more tolerant of violence, that may be a spot on the hillside at which things stop. We may not slide all the way down to the end of civilization. And so we have not yet been given sufficient reason to accept the arguer's conclusion that we must make animal experimentation illegal right now. Again, of course, this premise could depend on, and as we discussed, that could depend on the assumptions and the moral assumption that people believe in. And it's different for different people, and therefore some people are more likely to accept this argument just because it goes in line with their values and morals. But in this context, we have a lot of assumptions, but we don't have enough evidence. We don't have enough explanations and data to support this argument, and therefore we cannot really believe this argument. Like post-hoc slippery slope can be tricky fallacy to identify, since sometimes the chain of events really can be predicted to follow certain actions. Here's the example that does seem fallacious. If I fail English 101, I won't be able to graduate. If I don't graduate, probably I won't be able to get a job. And I may very well end up doing temporary work of flipping burgers for the next year. That's a very dramatic chain of events. It is possible, but not very likely. Therefore, we have to be careful when we make certain type of generalizations or hasty conclusions, or try to predict certain things happening in a certain way. Of course, it could depend on your being optimist or pessimist, of course, and the way you deal with problems, because some people deal with problems and the slippery slope is a mode of thinking. So we have to be careful about that. We have to observe if we do that in our minds, or we have to be careful if we see that in an article and try not to specifically go on this wrong road, a slippery slope. We have to be careful as to examine this fallacy. Red herring. Partway through an argument, arguer goes off tangent, raising a side issue that distracts the audience from what is really at stake. Often the arguer never returns to the original issue. Grading this exam on a curve would be the most fair things to do. After all, classes go more smoothly when students and professor are getting along well. Let's try our premise conclusion outlining to see what's wrong with this argument. Premise: classes go more smoothly when students and professors are getting along well. Grading this exam on a curve would be most fair thing to do. So as you can see, premise and conclusion are not connected. To explain it more clearly, classes go smoothly. So it's true that when we have, when teachers and students get along, when they have, I don't know, mutual respect and they listen to each other, the classes go really more smoothly. But how does it relate to the grading of the exam? So grading as a system of assessment. Grading on a curve is a specific type of, giving grades on a test. But how can premise support the conclusion? It actually doesn't. And that's called to go off tangent, to go off topic. And this is a strategy that's sometimes used by politicians, sometimes it's used by kids, and we can totally see it. We just have to be very careful of it, that we don't go off tangent and we remember what is being discussed, what the author is trying to prove. When we lay it out this way, it's pretty obvious that the arguer went off tangent, and the fact that something helps people to get along doesn't necessarily make it more fair. Fairness and justice sometimes require us to do things that cause conflict. But audience may feel like the issue of teachers and students agreeing is more important and be distracted from the fact that arguer has not given any evidence to why curve would be fair. Trying laying your premises and conclusion out in outline like a form. How many issues do you see being raised in argument? Can you explain how each premise supports the conclusion? If you can't, that's certainly a bad argument, and you have to be careful about it and try to avoid using similar arguments in your essays. False dichotomy. In a false dichotomy, the arguer set up the situation, so it looks like there is only two choices. The arguer then eliminates one of the choices, so it seems that we are left with only one option. One the arguer wanted us to pick in the first place, but often there are really many different options, not just two. And if we thought about them, we might not be so quick to pick one the arguer recommends. So dichotomy is like when we talk about two things, right? Black and white, that's the dichotomy, but there could be like other dichotomies, like, and in this context, the author is limiting our choices so as to, force us to choose certain option that he or she believes is correct. So Caldwell Hall is in a bad shape. Either we tear it down or put a new building. If we continue to risk, student safety. Obviously, we shouldn't risk anyone's safety, so we must tear the building down. The argument neglects to mention the possibility that we might repair the building to find some way to protect the students from the risk in the question. For example, only a few rooms are in bad shape. Perhaps we shouldn't hold classes in those rooms. So, in this context, the tip to think about: examine your own arguments. If you're saying that we have to choose between just two options, is that really so? Or there are other alternatives you haven't mentioned? If there are other alternatives, don't just ignore them. Explain why there are two should be ruled out. Although there's no formal name for it, assuming that there are only 3 options, 4 options, when there are really more, is similar to false dichotomy, and it should be avoided. So we have to be really thinking, are there any other choices and why we rule them out? And that's to avoid the false dichotomy, or even limiting the choice of people to 3 or 4 options is still not good. So we have to, and that's what the critical thinking is, looking for different options, different facets, different factors that affect the question. So how do I find fallacies in my own writing? Here are some general tips for finding fallacies in your own arguments. Pretend you disagree with conclusion you're defending. What parts of the argument would now seem fishy to you? So you try to be critical towards your own argument. So you write your essay, for example, and then you read it again. Or you say something and then think back about it. So it's very important to be, introspective and retrospective. What part would seem easiest to attack? Give special attention to strengthening those parts. And that's especially good if you are participating in debates or judging the debates. That's very important. List your main points. Under each one, list the evidence you have for it. Seeing your claims and evidence laid out this way may make you realize that you have no good evidence for a particular claim, or you may help you look critically at the evidence you're using. Learn which types of fallacies you're especially prone to, and be careful to check them in your work. Some writers make lots of appeal to authority. Others more likely to rely on weak analogies and set a straw man. Read over your old papers and see if there are particular kind of fallacy you need to watch out for. Be aware that broad claims need for proof than narrow ones. Claim, use sweeping words like all, no, none, every, always, never, no one, everyone are sometimes appropriate, but they require a lot more proof than less sweeping claims. Words such as some, many, few, sometimes, usually, and so forth. Double check your characterization of others, especially your opponents, to be sure they're accurate and fair. So be careful about that. Be mindful about the claims that you make, not to make them too general or too specific, to avoid the hasty generalizations. And of course, if you want to know more, you can find out about other types of fallacies, because there are so many more. And we discussed a very basic list because I didn't want to spend all this time to discuss the fallacies. But if you're curious, there are certain courses on EDX, on Coursera, on critical thinking. One that I really like is Everyday Thinking. I think it's EDX. It's fantastic. It's the one that I took some 2 years ago. And it was a wonderful course, very interesting to learn about your own assumptions, to learn about certain fallacies that we have. So on the next lecture, we're going to discuss a different topic, and those are thinking about thinking. So we just started to do that, to think, is there any way that I am misinterpreting something or making it the wrong way? So next time, we're going to observe certain biases. We're going to observe, again, traps that we have when thinking about our learning or about any arguments that we might have. So think about that. Be careful about your own using the fallacies in your essays or spotting them in other people's essays, and be a critical thinker. That's pretty much what this lecture is about.